welcome to episode 24 of the Absid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamicate history and a global medieval past, and another instalment of a 12-part series entitled A Spring of Classical Arabic Poetry with Dr. Kevin Blankinship at Brigham Young University in Utah. Part 6, al-Ḥallāj, 858-922 Common Era, Life, Works and Poetic Legacy of a Martyred Mystic. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. I'm your host, Al-Hassan, a PhD student in the School of Origin and African Studies in London. Now on to the show. Abu al-Mughith al-Hussein bin Mansur al-Ḥallāj was a Persian mystic poet and teacher of Sufism, best known for his saying, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, which some saw as a blasphemous claim to divinity, while others interpreted as an instance of the annihilation of the ego to the divine will. Al-Ḥallāj was executed not before dividing Muslim society over his statements and actions. To discuss with me his life, work and legacy as a poet is Dr. Kevin Blankinship. Welcome, Dr. Blankinship.
Hi, Talha. Thanks for having me.
Al-Ḥallāj was born after the triumph of Hanbali Sunnism over attempts at caliphal enforcement of the so-called rationalist Mu'tazilite school of theology upon its subjects. Tell us more about Al-Ḥallāj's socio-political and cultural context.
Before I start talking about his context, socio-political and cultural, I wanted to make a quick note about the reason for choosing Al-Ḥallāj in this series of classical Arabic poetry. Typically, he sort of falls outside the main of belletristic Arabic poetry. If you look at a typical syllabus for Arabic poetry, Ḥallāj may or may not appear on it. A lot of textbooks of literature wouldn't include him. He would be more appropriate, in this view, for a religious studies syllabus or perhaps a course on Islamic mysticism or Sufism. And so I thought to include Ḥallāj for two reasons, partly because the first one is that his poetry was important to his output and to his expression, his mystical expression. The other thing is that it helps us understand a bit more about different kinds of poetry. Recently, Oludamini Ogunaike at the University of Virginia, in his book, has a recent book called Poetry in Praise of Prophetic Perfection, Western African Madih poetry and its precedents. And it's about sort of the West African tradition of poetry in praise of the Prophet Muhammad. And he points out that this poetry is not bookish and rhetorically complex the way that someone like Abu Tamam or al-Ma'ari or even al-Mutanabbi would have written poetry. But he compares this to, reading lyrics in a book or poetry in a book versus sung lyrics, which if you read them typically are not sort of the most rhetorically interesting, but that's because they're meant to be performed. And so he talks about how the performative aspect and the experiential aspect are really important to understand this kind of poetry, whether praise poetry to the Prophet Muhammad or to the kind of poetry we'll be discussing with Ḥallāj. So just to help listeners understand a bit more why I chose this and to introduce people to a different mode of poetry, which is still very important. The age in which Al-Ḥallāj lived was one in which many people thought that the world was coming to an end. The great historian and Quran commentator al-Tabari expressed this, describing what was his own time and place. And in modern times, James Montgomery talks about an apocalyptic age, which was the express purpose for the prose stylist al-Jahidh to write his magnificent book of the living, which he hoped would restore society. This discussion is the beginning of Montgomery's book, al-Jahidh in Praise of Books. What made people think the end times were near? For one thing, there was the rebellion of the enslaved Bantu-speaking Zenj, who had been captured from the west coast of East Africa and transported to Iraq to drain the region's salt marshes. This insurrection lasted almost 14 years, from 869 to 883 Common Era, and began near Basra, led by one Ali ibn Muhammad. It grew to involve slaves and freemen, including both blacks and Arabs, from several regions of the Caliphate, and, according to reports, claimed tens of thousands of lives before it was finally defeated. This period was also defined by rebellion by the Qarmatiyans, a syncretic branch of Ismaili Shiites. They considered the pilgrimage to Mecca a superstition, and once in control of the Bahraini state, they launched raids along the pilgrim routes crossing the Arabian Peninsula. And in 906 Common Era, they ambushed the pilgrim caravan returning from Mecca and massacred 20,000 pilgrims. They sacked Mecca and Medina in 930, desecrating the Zemzem well with corpses of Hajj pilgrims, and stole the black stone. These events are important to understand the overall precariousness of the age and the sense of fear and uncertainty that prevailed among many populations. They're also important to Ḥallāj's story in particular because his enemies implicated him in both the Zenj rebellion and the Qarmati revolts, which we'll talk about a bit later. There were not only these problems from without, but also Abbasid court intrigue, which is important to understand al-Ḥallāj's context. Some reformers under the Hanbali influence of Barbahari made a failed attempt to seize power and make the poet and anthologist Ibn al-Mu'taz caliph. And in fact, he's still known today as caliph for a day. Ultimately, they didn't succeed, and the infant caliph al-Muqtadir was restored, his vizier being the financier Ibn al-Furat, who essentially ruled alongside the queen mother. Al-Ḥallāj became caught up in these intrigues, which is a large part of why he fell out of favor with those in power and ultimately was convicted and executed.
Al-Ḥallāj was born in modern-day Iran and moved to Wasit in modern-day Iraq, where he memorized the Quran aged 12. He had an eventful career prior to his execution in 922 Common Era. What do we know about Al-Ḥallāj's life?
Al-Ḥallāj was born in the Fars province of Persia to a cotton carder. Ḥallāj means cotton carder in Arabic, in a town called Al-Bayda. And as you mentioned, he'd memorized the Quran by age 12, and at age 16, he began studying with the Sufi mystic Sahl al-Tustari. When he was 20, he left Tustari to go to Basra, and there he received the habit of the Sufis from Amr Mekki and married al-Hussein, the daughter of Abu Yaqub al-Aqta'. This was a troubled marriage, though, and soon Al-Ḥallāj went to Baghdad to seek the advice of Junayd, who himself was a Sufi figure and took a more cool-headed, sober approach to mysticism versus the ecstatic, drunk Sufi tendencies of Al-Ḥallāj, drunk in quotation marks. Because of this tension between master and student, it's said that Junayd refused him the Sufi cloak that was the sign of initiation into the masters. Through his brother-in-law, Akarnabai, Al-Ḥallāj found himself in contact with a clan that supported the Zaydi rebellion of the Zenj, and this clan flirted in varying degrees with Shiite extremism. And this is probably the origin of a persistent but unfounded claim that Al-Ḥallāj was a Shiite da'i or missionary preacher, and this reputation would later haunt him as it became one of the charges for which he was ultimately tried and convicted. Ḥallāj went on the pilgrimage 3 times in his life. Between the second and third times, he spent a while preaching in India. After the third and final pilgrimage, he came back to Baghdad and set up in his house a model of the Kaaba, it is said, prayed at night beside tombs, and in the daytime he proclaimed his burning love of God and his desire to die for his community. And this kind of behavior, as you might imagine, raised more than a few eyebrows. The Dhahiri, Muhammad ibn Dawood, denounced him at court and called for his execution, but the Shafi'i jurist Ibn Surayj defended him, saying that that mystic inspiration was beyond the jurisdiction of the courts. It was around this time that Al-Ḥallāj supposedly uttered his best known phrase as a reply to Abu Bakr al-Shibli, another disciple of Junayd and a famous Sufi in his own right, Ana al-Haq. And the significance of this phrase hopefully is known to many people, but just to sum up, al-Haq, of course, means truth, literally, but it's an epithet for God. It's a name for God. And so by doing this, many people saw it as Al-Ḥallāj, tantamount to Al-Ḥallāj calling himself God. So supposedly for this, he was imprisoned for 9 years before being condemned and executed. There was both a religious pretext and a political one for doing so. In terms of the religious pretext, Al-Ḥallāj's unmeasured utterances called into question the secrecy that had become the rule in Sufi circles ever since Nuri and his followers had been called to give an account before the courts of their teaching on the love of God. Al-Ḥallāj was also concerned for giving an inner significance to ritual acts. For example, proceed 7 times round the Kaaba of your heart. And this was denounced as a wish to abolish the acts themselves. Some people even saw his view as support for the Qarmati rebels who wished to destroy the Kaaba. Ḥallāj was also accused of belief in hulul, incarnationism. the basis of which charge might come from a verse of poetry in which Ḥallāj declares mystical union in terms of two spirits in one body. I'll read this at the end of the episode, this line. But the political pretext also matters. To sum up, at the court of the infant caliph al-Muqtadir, there was a pro-Ḥallāj faction led by the vizier Ibn Isa and an anti-Ḥallāj faction led by Ibn Isa's successor, the vizier Ibn al-Furat, and then his successor, Hamid. Supposedly, Hamid felt threatened by supporters of Ḥallāj who openly criticized him, Hamid, for engaging in financial speculation. And it was in order to strike a blow against those critics that he reopened Ḥallāj's trial, which had previously been closed in 913 Common Era by Ibn Isa. And Hamid, in order to do this, rallied support from religious leaders and judges. This group charged al-Ḥallāj with being a rabble-rouser who threatened the public order and eventually were able to force a tribunal that condemned al-Ḥallāj to death. And in front of a large crowd with a crown on his head, al-Ḥallāj was beaten and exposed, still alive, on a gibbet, salib. There were riots, and friends and enemies questioned him as he hung on what is essentially a cross, and traditions relate some of his replies. The next day, he was beheaded, burned, and his ashes were spread in the Tigris. He was rightly executed for blasphemy and for destroying the social order, while for others, he was a martyr who sealed his teachings with his blood.
In Sufi nomenclature, there is a term called shathiyat, which is not unlike the Christian concept of speaking in tongues. Indeed, al-Ḥallāj's Kitab al-Tawasin contained diagrams and symbols where words were insufficient to describe religious profundities. Describe the works of Ḥallāj to us.
We can summarize the main thrust of al-Ḥallāj's writings by saying that they are either meditations on themes that symbolize the progress of the mystic in his quest for God, or else the direct, especially poetic, expression of that progress. There's little secondary information that can be confirmed historically, but a number of anecdotes and aphorisms survive in a collection called Akhbar al-Ḥallāj. Aside from this, there's a collection of poetry attributed to him, and then this very strange work, which you mentioned, called the Kitab al-Tawasin. On the concept of ecstatic utterances, or shathiyat, al-Ḥallāj wasn't the only one who got in trouble for saying the quiet part out loud, as we might call it today. Abu Yazid Bistami, also known as Boy Yazid Bistami in the Persian tradition, was notorious for his saying, "Glory be to me, Subhani," which is, of course, a phrase normally reserved for God alone. There's a whole book by the late 10th century mystic Abu Nasr as-Sarraj on ecstatic utterances called the Book of Flashes, Kitab al-Lum'a, and it reproduces sayings by figures like Sahel al-Tustari, Muhammad ibn Salim and his son Ahmad, Junaid, Bistami, and others. These sayings are meant to express unity with the divine, but at the same time, they're meant to show the inexpressibility of that union. The technical term for this is apophatic expression, namely language which is incapable of saying anything or meaning anything. Being familiar with ecstatic utterances is important for understanding Ḥallāj's poetry in particular. While the language is not difficult in terms of lexical meaning, rhetorical figures, or difficult syntax, it can get tied up in its own discourse very quickly in a vivid apophasis like what's found in ecstatic utterances. Just to take a brief example, much of Ḥallāj's poetry directly addresses the lover, who is, of course, deity or the divine, to which that poetry is directed. The technical term for this is apostrophe, direct address. The following displays this beautifully, and it's probably his best-known poem, Ra'aytu Rabbi. I saw my Lord with the eye of the heart. I said, "Who are you?" He answered, "You." Thus, where has nowhere as from you, nor is there as to you a where. And it goes on like this. As for the Tawasin, the title is a plural form of the heading for section 6, which begins with the names of two Arabic letters, Ta and Sin. The meaning of these letters is unclear, just like the huruf al-muqatta'a that begin several Quranic surahs. The sections of the work vary in length and subject matter. The first, the Ta-Sin of the glass lamp, Ta-Sin as-Siraj, is an homage to the Prophet Muhammad, while chapters 4 and 5, for example, talk about the Prophet's heavenly ascent or Mi'raj. Michael Sells translated the longest section of the Tawasin of Ḥallāj in the volume Early Islamic Mysticism, which I recommend to anyone looking for more information. This section is the Ta-Sin of before time and ambiguity, Ta-Sin al-Azal wal-Iltibas, which presents the story of Iblis as a tragic lover, the intimate companion of deity and the one true monotheist, since he refused to pray to anything other than God, even after God himself commanded him and the angels to prostrate in prayer before the newly created Adam. This Miltonian Satan avant la lettre has dialogues in the Tawasin with God, Moses, Pharaoh, and Muhammad, in which Iblis affirms his commitment to worship God alone. In the dialogue with Muhammad, for example, we read this excerpt in Michael Sells' translation. He, Iblis, was told, "Bow down." He said, "To no other." He was asked, "Even if you receive my curse," meaning God's curse, he said, "It does not matter. I have no way to an other than you. I am an abject lover."
Al-Ḥallāj divided the society of his time, and he continues to be a divisive figure. What has been his lasting impact and legacy, and where should listeners turn to learn more about this remarkable figure's life and works?
It's hard to consider Ḥallāj a classical Sufi in the sense that his teachings were passed on formally through Sufi schools, unlike Junaid, for example. There's no Ḥallāji order like there is a Mevlevi or Shadhili order, although apparently there was for a time, since Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi lists the Ḥallājiyya among the sects which had to be treated legally as apostates. This is in the first half of the 11th century. A certain number of disciples fled to Khurasan, where several of them took part in the Hanafi Maturidi reform movement. But no such order exists today, to my knowledge. On the other hand, al-Ḥallāj is a classic in the sense that his works and his life are still read and debated. He's perhaps better known in the West than any other Sufi except Rumi, although that's not saying much since knowledge of Sufism in the West is still very, very limited, too limited. Much of his fame in the West is due to the life's work of the Catholic French Orientalist Louis Massignon, who Massignon was a pioneer of Islamic studies in the West, especially from a viewpoint of sympathizing with the subject of study. He wrote a 4-volume study called The Passion of al-Ḥallāj, and even in just this title, the emphasis on Christian echoes is very clear. There's an English abridgment and translation by Herbert Mason called Ḥallāj, Mystic and Martyr, in case listeners want to read this work. Massignon's work still holds up in many ways, but to read it carefully, one has to understand that the life and legacy of al-Ḥallāj gets reflected through the prism of Massignon's own charismatic persona. For this reason, Massignon had both critics and supporters. Many Catholics called him a syncretist, a quote-unquote Catholic Muslim, although this was also used as a compliment by Pope Pius XI. Many Muslims thought he focused too much on figures and practices considered by many to be marginal, and for paying too much attention to Sufism and not enough to Islamic legalism. On the other hand, some saw this as an advantage. Edward Said wrote that Massignon used Ḥallāj, quote, to embody, to incarnate values essentially outlawed by the mainstream doctrinal system of Islam, a system that Massignon himself described mainly in order to circumvent it with al-Ḥallāj, end quote. One thing that will be familiar to many listeners is the continuity of the Sufi tradition in music and song, and al-Ḥallāj is no exception. For decades, modern singers have put his words to music, to say nothing of practicing Sufis themselves who make recitation and music a part of their worship. And a simple Google search or YouTube search will bring up many songs of his poems set to music. Other places to go for more information include a translation in 2018 by Carl Ernst of Ḥallāj's poetry. And it's called Ḥallāj, Poems of a Sufi Martyr. And if I can be a bit gauche and suggest something from a more popular venue, which is a moment of weakness, which my purist academic listeners will excuse me, Robin Cresswell has a great essay in the New York Review of Books called An Enthusiastic Sect. Finally,
let's end with a sample from al-Ḥallāj and the translation.
I want to read some selections in the English translation of Martin Lings, who was a published poet in his own right, a practicing Alawiya Sufi, and an authority on Shakespeare as well as Arabic and Islamic studies. His style is a bit more archaic, but still lovely in my view. I'm interested for listeners to hear a variety of translations, which is why partly why I bring his version. There are few people better positioned than Dr. Lings was to bring the poetry of al-Ḥallāj to English readers. Those listening will also note the use of themes like erotic love in order to express direct experience of the divine. So these are selections from some of his poems. It's not all one poem altogether. So, but I'll read one line in Arabic of one of the selections and then continue in the English. So the Arabic starts, أأنت أم أنا هذا في إلهين حاشاك حاشاك من إثبات اثنين. Is it thou or I, these twain, two gods? Far be it from you to affirm two. Selfhood is in my nothingness forever. Mine all over all casts illusions twofold. For where is thine essence? Where from me, for me to see, when mine hath no where, as already is plain? And thy countenance, where with my two sights may I seek it? In the seeing of my heart, or the seeing of my eye? Twixt thee and me, an I am is, or crowding me. Take by thine own I am from between us. For the lights of religion's light are lights in men. For the secrets in secret depths of souls. And for beings in beings is a being that saith be. Reserved for it my heart is, guided and chosen. O ponder what I say with the intellect's eye. Keen is the intellect of hearing and of insight. Earnest for truth, I thought on the religions. They are, I found, one root with many a branch. Therefore impose on no man a religion, lest it should bar him from the firm set root. Let the root claim him, a root wherein all heights and meanings are made clear for him to grasp. O thou who blamest me my love for him, how harsh thou art. But if thou didst but know how I have been enriched by him, thou wouldst not blame me. Men have their pilgrimage, and I have mine. Unto my guest within, they offer beasts in sacrifice. I offer my heart's blood. A folk there is whose rounds are not on foot. Round God they go, absolved from round his house. And then this final couplet contains the line for which al-Ḥallāj was accused of belief in incarnationism. He am I whom I love. He am I whom I love. He whom I love is I, two spirits in one single body dwelling. So seest thou me, then seest thou him. And seest thou him, then seest thou us.
Dr. Blankinship, thank you again.
Thank you, Talha.
Great work.